Greetings and welcome back. Talked about Britain, talked about France, and the next country that I'm going to talk about is Germany in the course. But I thought that I would do a couple of things by starting this section off with an article that I co-authored. I co-authored three different articles with my mentor. This one in Political Science Quarterly is, I believe, the best thing I've ever written, and it got quite a bit of acclaim. You can do a Google Scholar search, and you'll see that this article has been cited in a few books. And in fact, I even had a preliminary job offer because of this article. So I'm really proud of it. But mainly, I'm proud of this because I got to collaborate with someone who wasn't just my mentor, but a dear, dear friend, and in many ways became like a father figure to me, and is one of the major academic inspirations in my life. The genesis for this article is quite intriguing. It started out as a discussion at an Oakland A's New York Yankees baseball game, and my mentor and I used to go watch a lot of baseball together. And in almost every game, we ended up mixing politics and baseball, which were two things that both of us liked. And by the end of this baseball game, the basic ideas of this article were already flushed out. And at that point, we were looking for quotations and organization, but every major idea was fleshed out at that game, which is kind of intriguing. This article, which was published in Political Science Quarterly in 1991, has various elements to it. In many ways, I think of it as being like an octopus. It begins as an analysis of international relations theory and why we think that international relations theory at the time was incomplete. But as you go on in the article, it becomes increasingly focused in the arena of comparative politics, analyzing domestic politics, and I think you can even say that there is an element of political psychology there. So I'm going to, I don't know, I'm planning on having two lectures. We'll see if I can cover this in two lectures. I do have the article beside me because there are a few quotes that I want to point out as perhaps more important than others as you go through them. I will point out uh, potential exam questions that you're likely to see, and obviously, the first one is a giveaway question. Basically, what is this article about? And the focus of the article is international alliances. And for forever, you can go back even to writings that are a few hundred years old. But the traditional notion of alliances and the dominant notion even today is that alliances are closely linked with power, with the enhancement of state capabilities, that alliances are going to make you stronger, they're going to make you safer, they're going to make you better off than if you don't have them. I'm going to add something that I didn't put in the article, but I think that you should keep in mind. States have two primary means to increase their power. One is to expand their internal capabilities, which I did not talk about, or my mentor, we did not talk about in this article. You can go out and you can increase your military attributes. You can build up your army, your navy, your air force. You can build up your economic resources, or you can go out and form alliances. Of course, the problem with alliances is how committed to the partnership are your alliance partners. Perhaps they're very committed and you're fine. Perhaps they're not as committed. I want you to write down in the margin this formula that I would write on the board if we were meeting face to face, and that is A plus B equals power. And A is attributes. Attributes. They're easy to measure. How many planes do you have? How many aircraft carriers do you have? How many men in uniform do you have? You can go on and on and on. What are the attributes of your country? The second one is much more difficult, and that is behavior. And sometimes, as you know, in wars, countries that on paper are weaker win because they have a greater willingness to suffer. The war means more to them, they're willing to sacrifice. And behavior sometimes is misinterpreted by your rivals. I'll give you an example. When I was an undergraduate, I paid my way through school largely my last 2 years of college, and some of you know this, I've mentioned this before, playing poker. In poker, you have attributes, you have cards you play, and you have behavior attributed to the game in terms of how you play. Are you an aggressive player? Are you a conservative player? Do you bluff a lot? Do you almost never bluff, etc.? The reason I'm going to bring this up is that Adolf Hitler engages in a great bluff. In the Rhineland crisis, he has the weakest hand. He has a smaller military, a much smaller army, a much smaller navy, a much smaller air force in 1936 than the French. I didn't mention this, or we didn't mention this in the article, that Hitler had told his generals that if there were resistance to quickly get out of there, because there's no way that we could prevail in a war against the French. But Adolf Hitler engages in a great bluff in this case. He has the weakest hand, but he does not believe that the French and the British are going to call the hand. He believes that if he makes a move, they are going to do absolutely nothing. And I bring up poker because this is exactly what I did. I played poker, and the biggest hand I've ever won in a poker game. It wasn't a whole lot of money for me as a college student. It was a fortune. It was a little over $1,400. I had the weakest hand at the table. But my reputation was that I was very conservative. I was very cautious. I only bet big if I had a huge hand. In this case, I missed my hand, but I played it huge. Everyone thought I'd hit my hand. They all folded. Anyone at the table would have beat me. And that's what happens here. The British have a stronger hand than Hitler. The French have a stronger hand than Hitler, but Hitler bluffs and he wins in this case because, well, that's kind of the fun part of the story. But I think it's important that you understand that power isn't just objective. It isn't just what you can see. That power has a subjective element. We often talk about, does a country or an actor have credibility, for example. So in this particular case, the alliance, which was supposed to strengthen French capabilities, did not do that. In fact, the commitment to the alliance and the dependence on Britain actually undermined their ability psychologically to go at it with the Germans one-on-one. And I will talk about that in a lot more detail. So the significance of this and what you should star, what you're likely to see on the exam, is not only are we focusing in on international alliances, but this article absolutely rejects outright the conventional view of international relations theorists. And the conventional view of theorists are that alliances make you stronger. While that may be true in many cases, the point of this article is that that is not always true. And certainly there are perhaps other case studies where a commitment to an alliance created a latent psychological dependence that undermined their ability to act alone. And in my mind, what this article demonstrates is absolutely the weakness of the French Third Republic. In the last section of the course, one of the reasons why de Gaulle established the current constitution, the Fifth Republic, is because de Gaulle saw the Third and Fourth Republics as disasters, as not responding to crisis, And certainly the inability of the French to stand up to Hitler during the Third Republic is one of the primary reasons why de Gaulle wanted to create a much more conservative democracy in France, and did. So, what are some weaknesses of the French Third Republic that we see in this article? Well, the French avoided costly and risky measures to create illusions about vigorous but largely empty diplomatic activity. They did this for political reasons. Certainly, these alliances were politically useful to them at home, and it allowed them to escape difficult choices. But the problem is that as you read through this article, hopefully what you will see is that alliance diplomacy did not meet France's security needs and instead nourished public illusions with respect to the support of France by the League of Nations, by the signatories of the Locarno Pact, by Poland, by Yugoslavia, and of course, from the French perspective, the most important alliance partner was the British. The French did simply not believe that they could resist Germany without British support, and that turned out to be a disastrous miscalculation. So if you look at this crisis, what is the case study? The case study is the Rhineland crisis of 1936. From the end of World War I up until 1936, France's chief objective was the containment of Germany through alliances. That's not necessarily in and of itself a bad thing. You could argue, for example, that this was the policy of the United States. That after World War II, the primary policy objective of the United States was the containment of the Soviet Union, and that the United States did this through alliances. They did this through the creation of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, through the creation of SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, through MITO, the Middle Eastern Treaty Organization, and others. And certainly in the case of the Soviet Union, even though there were skirmishes between the United States and the Soviet Union, and even though the United States and the Soviet Union came eyeball to eyeball during the Cuban Missile Crisis, many would claim that the alliance policy of the United States was successful towards the Soviet Union. But the big difference is that the United States drove these alliances. The United States was committed to these alliances, but the United States was willing and often did act alone during time of crisis without consulting their allies. That's how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. So in the case of the United States, alliance politics works because the United States was committed to these alliances, but willing to go alone if need be. The French, on the other hand, were not willing to do this, even though when Hitler invaded the Rhineland on March 7, 1936, the French, the British, statesmen all throughout Europe saw that this military occupation of the Rhineland was indeed a clear violation of the Locarno Pact. The French leaders knew that the German action was illegal. They understood that this was very dangerous and that this was a dangerous threat to their national security. And most importantly, what all of the actors understood was that Hitler's military occupation of the Rhineland was a major test of the actors' commitment to their alliances. And even though France had military assistance pacts with Poland, with Czechoslovakia, with the Soviet Union, in this particular case, the occupation of the Rhineland was a clear violation of the Locarno Pact, which guaranteed the western borders of Germany. Belgium, Italy, France, Britain, and Germany all pledged to support the Locarno Pact. In this particular case, they were unwilling, and so was the League of Nations, to engage in collective security to contain this aggression and safeguard the territorial status quo of Europe.